Good evening, and a very warm welcome to everyone during today's Facebook Live session. My name is Sharon, and I'll be your host for today's Facebook event. For those of you who are new, Vichar Manthan, or VM for short, meaning the churning of thoughts and ideas, is an organization that seeks to explore pertinent issues affecting modern British society through a dharmic lens. We are joined today by three fantastic panelists, all who are experts in their field on the topic pandemics, the past, the present, and the future. Our first panelist, Ravi Ladva, public historian with an avid interest in Indian history, and an advisor for a group called Insight, will take us back through the ages to reflect on previous pandemics. Our next speaker, Dr. George Thompson, ex-medical director, current frontline NHS consultant, will shed some light on the current COVID-19 crisis, in particular, the healthcare system. And last but not least, our last speaker, Dr. Pippa Malmgren, ex-advisor of the White House, leading economist and tech entrepreneur, will provide some information on the current economic stance of both the UK and globally. In particular, what the future has to hold for all of us. Today's format will take place in the form of open remarks of each of our panelists, followed by a panel discussion, during which we'll answer questions by you, the audience, as well. Please drop us your questions in the comments group at the bottom, and we'll take these questions and answer it as well. Throughout the session, we'll have live polls. We encourage you to take part in live polls, after which the results will be published post the event. I now request you to take a step back, enjoy the rest of the month in, as I pass you over to our speaker, Ravi Ladva.
Namaste everyone, thank you for joining us today. Today's topic of history, I'm going to start off with a passage from Flushed, How the Plumbers Saved Civilization. They built water systems that in many ways would rival and surpass other systems. Not only did the ruling elite have indoor plumbing, but so did the whole city. Each solid brick home, many of which were two-storied, contained bathrooms, when covered with plaster, made them waterproof. They also had flushable lavatories citywide. Nothing like this existed in the world at the time, even for today's half the world's population. You're all probably imagining some place like ancient Rome or Renaissance Venice, maybe even an early London. The place that's actually been described in the book is a settlement in the Indus Valley. Our understanding of what public health is drifts to doctors, nurses, and other professionals. However, that's only half the equation. Civil engineers, policymakers, and decision makers, you can have the most amazing healthcare professionals and systems, but if there's no clean water, electricity, or roads, then it's difficult to get medicines and help from A to B. That requires decision-making policies and to enable engineers to do their research, develop, and then act. So we'll start off with the Bronze Age, and then we'll move quickly through history and trying to be succinct about these things. So all major Bronze Age civilizations, from the Egyptians, Mesopotamians, Indians, all founded their major urban centers on fresh water sources. So the Nile, the Euphrates, and the Saraswati. There was a huge explosion of growth. Urban settlements gave humans longer life and a greater technical ability and knowledge. The early farmers had a closer relationship with domesticated animals, even sometimes living with them. The collapse of the Bronze Age civilizations is usually attributed to climate change or forcing migrations and shortage of resources. As the climate did change, it brought human populations into new areas, and epidemics soon followed. The pastoralists that developed tolerance to these animals as they lived closer to them then carried the microbes and pathogens to other areas which were lethal to residents. The loss of these Bronze Age civilizations is where the relationship between healthcare and engineering diverges. It actually wouldn't be until the Greco-Carthaginian Roman engineers that Europe would have a similar relationship between engineering and healthcare. The creation of aqueducts, roads, and even water fountains allowed humanity to progress once again, and the interconnected world that was built is a good case study and starting point to our connected world and how epidemics can become pandemics. The two pandemics that I want to talk about that swept through the Iron and Middle Ages. The first is the Antonine Plague. It ended the Pax Romana, which was 2 centuries of relative Roman peace and prosperity. And the second is the Justinian Plague, which was a death blow to the Byzantine Empire, which was the last remnants of the Roman Empire. I mean, just for context to how deadly these were, the Antonine Plague was killing up to 2,000 people a day, and the Justinian Plague was killing up to 5,000 people a day. So the interconnected world allowed these pathogens to move a lot more swiftly, something that we can and we'll come back to later. The collapse of the Roman Empire would lead to the Dark Ages, and whilst the Dark Ages allowed other areas to flourish, it was a major setback for technical and engineering knowledge when it came to healthcare. This knowledge would exacerbate the next pandemic, the Black Death. Skipping forward to the Renaissance, and the Dark Ages would eventually come to an end, and it ushered in a Renaissance, the Industrial Revolution in our modern times. Whilst there have been setbacks to the scientific community through that period, it reforged its path back into society. With the rise of every empire, knowledge rose with it, and with every collapse, so did understanding. The regression up to this point is demonstrated by 2 key events, both taking place in London. The first is the prevalent theory at the time where plagues and epidemics were spread through bad air, something that was taken on board through the medieval period. But it was until Dr. John Snow and the Broad Street Bump that he located the source of a cholera outbreak that it was established again that these diseases could be waterborne. The second is the Great Stink of London in July and August of 1858. The hot weather exacerbated the smell of untreated human waste and industrial waste that was present on the banks of the River Thames. Sir Joseph William Bazalgette, the civil engineer, built London's sewage system. After much resistance and 8 different revisions, London's plight was finally resolved after a Herculean feat of engineering. These 2 pivotal moments triggered a new wave of rediscovery that brought public healthcare and civil engineering back together again. Around the world, public works and healthcare systems were updated thanks to technologies like transatlantic ships that spread knowledge faster. This also set the stage for the worst pandemic to hit the world since the Black Death, the Spanish flu. The Spanish flu, the prevailing theory that the Spanish flu begins with actually Chinese migrants in Canada in 1917 on their way to various World War I fronts. Among these laborers were a number of sick people with a flu-like virus that had affected North China in 1916. And in the US, they were springing up. So fatal and unique was this flu, doctors began sending reports to the national body for public health, but no one listened. Within the first 2 weeks of this report, 24 of the 36 largest military bases in the US had this flu. Now, it's important to mention that we had, or at the time, doctors like Dr. William H. Welch, were pioneers in their field. They spread the use of microscopes and set up the Rockefeller Institute for research and testing. And he, in fact, warned the American establishment that you would need to set up an epidemic response team at the outbreak of war, because you'd have lots of people in short, small confined spaces. As the epidemic grew, and by the time Dr. Welch realized what had happened, 6,000 people were already dead. The army and politicians were slow to respond, but he didn't hesitate. He actually sent doctors all over the country to take samples and track its progress. However, Dr. Welch was fighting measles. Even though there were some reports of influenza, it was considered seasonal and would go away on its own. The measles treatment that was being shipped around actually gave them some breathing space. But by this time, those Chinese migrants had arrived on the Western Front, and thanks to, and unfortunately, the conditions of the World War I front, lack of rest, lack of sanitation, the influenza virus mutated and became a more formidable strain. The Spanish flu, by its end, in the space of 18 months, would leave up to 100 million people dead. And the interconnected world would see sporadic rises and outbreaks. And a lot of this was down to decision-making and understanding of what was going on. Whilst a number of viruses and diseases had been fought back, diphtheria and smallpox, the idea that something even smaller than that could exist was unknown to them. There was at one stage, they threw every known vaccine at this influenza outbreak and it did nothing. But as a result of this outbreak, it laid the foundation to another renaissance in science and civil engineering and healthcare.
Thank you for your speech. I'd like now to pass you over to Dr. George Thompson to give his opening remarks.
Thank you, and good evening. Thank you for inviting me to speak. I'm going to talk a little bit about the current pandemic, which is COVID-19, called COVID because it's the infectious disease caused by the new coronavirus that, as I think we all know, originated towards the end of 2019, we think probably from a wet market in China. So just to talk a little bit about the virus itself, this is a virus that is 70% the same as the SARS virus that the world saw back in 2003. And that's probably quite important because in 2004, the CDC in the States published very clear guidelines and lessons learned from the SARS outbreak. And unfortunately, those are lessons that I think we've learned and then forgotten. And that is a shame, really. The health system could have been much better set up around the world to cope with new pandemics. And it seems to have taken some time to get into gear in many countries. The virus itself is now called SARS-CoV-2 and is thought to be a mutation of the original SARS virus, probably coming out of one or more animal species. And unfortunately, the human population is naive to this virus, so we are really susceptible to it. And just to understand a little bit about the way that viruses work, it's probably useful to think of the concept of a key and a lock. So the virus has got what's called a spike protein, and that spike protein is the key that goes into the lock. In the case of SARS-CoV-2, the lock is the ACE2 receptor on cells. And it's usually, not always, but to a significant extent, the spike protein that the body forms antibodies to. A paper that I've just accepted for a journal that I work with is looking at the actual nature of the mutations. And it now appears that there are probably two mutations. The first one that came out in China is a mutation at the 614th position on the spike protein. And I'll not bore you with the science, but it's called the D mutation. And at some point, that seems to change to a different amino acid at that location, which is the G mutation. And data that have been analysed suggest that perhaps the reason that we saw lower apparent mortality rates in China, and actually also West USA, where the original virus spread quite quickly, is because that virus may actually be less deadly than the G mutation. And I'm hoping that that's going to be a paper that will be free to access very soon from the International Journal of Clinical Practice. From a personal perspective, I've seen quite a bit of COVID on the shop floor. And what struck me and all of my colleagues is the huge variety of clinical presentation that we see. It's probably very important to stress that for the majority of people, this seems to be quite a mild infection. But of course, sadly, for those in whom it becomes more severe, it can and has been repeatedly fatal. That's backed by so the experience on the shop floor is backed by research evidence. If we think back to the Diamond Princess, which was the cruise ship that was cruising the Far East just at the time that the COVID-19 pandemic started, they tested a lot of the passengers, and what they actually found was that 18% of those passengers that tested positive had absolutely no symptoms at the time that they were tested. Interestingly, those authors speculated that the likelihood was that it was because they were looking at an older population that the figure was as low as 18%, and they speculated that if they'd looked at a younger population, they may have seen a higher asymptomatic rate of infection. And that's borne out actually by data that come out of Iceland, which is probably one of the most useful test centres in the world at the moment. And I say that because they've randomly tested 10% of the entire population. So we've got a fairly representative sample. And what they found in what's called the DECODE study is that 50% of people who are infected have no symptoms at the time of testing positive. And interestingly also, and I'll come back to this when I talk a little bit about leaving lockdown, what they did was rigorously track those that tested positive and trace all the contacts of those that tested positive. And by doing that alone, Iceland seemed to have managed to flatten the curve and perhaps not have to go into such severe lockdown as many other countries. We've heard people speculate that this virus is like the flu. This is not the flu. And I need to move quickly through a little bit of epidemiology. You'll have heard the term R0. The R0 in epidemiological terms is basically talking about how contagious an infectious agent is. And R0 varies considerably for different viruses. So if we think about measles, which Ravi talked about briefly a few minutes ago, measles has got an R0 of 18. Mumps has got an R0 of 10, which means that these are very contagious agents that move through the human population very quickly in an exponential fashion. And that's why vaccination with MMR is so important for the human population. So if the R0 is equal to 1, that means that one person infected infects one other human being, and therefore the infection stays alive in a population, but it's a stable level of infection throughout that population. If the R0 is greater than 1, which is what we've seen with COVID-19, then the disease spreads exponentially because one individual infects 2, 3, 4, 5 other individuals, and they then go on to infect 2, 3, 4, 5 individuals. And so you can see how quickly you would get an exponential rise in number of cases. And where we need to get to is to achieve an R0 of less than 1, which means that one infected individual infects less than one other person, and therefore eventually a disease will die out if that situation pertains in the longer term. Looking at the R0 for COVID-19, the estimated figures vary. In the UK, we think the R0 was about 2.8 at the time that we entered lockdown. But I've seen data recently from China that have gone back and analysed the data in China outbreak, and they suggest that the R0 may be as high as 5.7 for this virus. So we've got a virus that's got an R0 of somewhere between 2.8 and 5.7, and you'll have heard the term herd immunity. What that R0 of 5.7 would imply is that 82% of the human population would need to be immune for the population to have herd immunity. So if the R0 is to be valid, 3 conditions have to pertain. Number 1, there's no vaccination program. Number 2, there is no prior herd immunity or partial herd immunity in the population. And number 3, there is no way that you can control spread. And if those situations pertain, then the only way you're going to actually stop an infection like COVID-19 is through complete lockdown, which is what most countries have put into place. And just to touch on Spanish flu, and I'm glad that Ravi talked more about it than I knew. Spanish flu was a mutation of the normal flu virus to what's called the H1N1 form. And that virus had an R0 of somewhere between 1.4 and 2.8. And that's why I say COVID-19 is not the flu. It's much more contagious than the flu, we think. But the Spanish flu happened in a historical era before we had modern medicine, before we had antibiotics like penicillins, etc., before we had well-developed socialized healthcare, before we had ventilators and large hospitals, etc. And so, in fact, H1N1 came back in 2009. You may remember we talked about a swine flu outbreak. And what we saw back in 2009 was that very quickly that viral infection was squashed through the use of vaccines and antiviral agents and modern medicine. And so I'll finish really on some thoughts on where we might need to get to be able to leave lockdown safely. In the UK, the government talk about 5 key tests, and I think those are really valid. And basically what that is saying is that the R0 needs to be less than 1 and stay less than 1, and that the NHS in the UK, but in other countries, their developed healthcare systems, need to continue to have capacity to look after cases that then do sporadically break out. And I think one of the lessons we'll probably find we learn from some of the healthcare systems in Europe, such as Italy and Spain, is that part of the very high mortality that we saw there is probably related to the fact that their healthcare systems were completely overrun and therefore just not able to actually look after people when they were really sick. And so I would speculate, and I've actually published an editorial fairly recently in IJCP, really trying to touch on this, that with a combined policy of lots of testing, tracking where you find a positive, and also tracing all contacts, continuing social distancing, probably using some sort of homemade face mask. And in the States, the CDC have advised that people going out in public should use a homemade face mask, leaving surgical and other masks for the healthcare sector. Spain have recently announced, I think today or yesterday, that anybody using public transport in Spain will have to wear a face mask. I think we may have to look at limited renewed local lockdowns if there's a sporadic outbreak in a particular town, city, part of the country. Antibody testing, we'll probably touch on that in discussion, but it's unclear at this stage how effective antibody testing will be. And then finally, places like South Korea have very successfully used mobile phone apps. And I see today that the UK government have announced that they're going to trial a mobile phone app to track and trace in the Isle of Wight. And at that, I'll probably finish. I'm going to be very happy to take questions later. Thank you.
Thank you, George, for your remarks. I'd like to pass you over now to Pippa, who'll give her open remarks as well today.
Great, thank you so much. So I'm going to talk about the future. And I'll start by saying one of the really interesting things about this COVID-19 is that the first layer of the triage has to do with the patients, the human beings affected. But the second part of the triage is the economy. And I don't think we've even really begun to properly understand what has happened during the lockdown. There's this idea that somehow you can hit the snooze button on the economy and then wake it up later when you're ready. But like COVID, we have pre-existing conditions that render the economy very vulnerable. And so companies that had a lot of debt, companies that didn't have cash flow, we will find they have not survived this period, that they have not been able to function. And that'll be a lot of restaurants and corner stores. It'll be a lot of different sorts of things, tech companies. And so there's a damage factor that governments have tried to address by offering free money, but it's not at all clear that any of that free money is actually making it to those organizations. So there's going to be a lot of questions about, did that free money just go to the banking system and the banking system didn't pass it on? The second thing is that, like COVID, there's, and I'm sure we'll get a more accurate analysis from the previous speaker, but it's a little bit like what the body does with the immune system. It seems a number of people are dying not so much directly from the COVID, but the body's immune reaction as it tries to kill the invader. Well, capitalism is very similar, and businesses will shut themselves down and effectively commit suicide before they incur a bigger loss. And so in anticipation of that loss, they will cease to exist. So there's going to be a lot of damage done that we have yet to assess. Now, having said that, there's a lot of speculation about what this recovery will look like. And I was very glad to hear the historical analysis, because I think it's absolutely right. We have regularly had pandemics in history. We do recover from them every time. We will absolutely recover from this one too. However, what is the shape of that recovery? And there's discussion, is it a V shape? Is it a W shape? Could it be like the World Wide Web, like several W's in a row? And I would argue that actually maybe it's not like letters. Maybe it's not linear. Maybe it's more quantum. And by that I mean I could easily envisage that what comes after this is something like what happened after the Spanish flu, when people had survived that and the First World War, that actually what you get is a quantum outcome where you have incredible prosperity and incredible poverty at the same time. And like in the 1920s, you get F. Scott Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby, and some people who are going to come out of this with extraordinary historic opportunities, and some who are more like in James Joyce's Ulysses, who are regular people who have been thrown off the economy and can't quite find their foothold again. Now, having said that, the 1920s was a period of history where extraordinary inventions occurred. We had literally automobiles and the airplane and refrigerators and washing machines and radio and the assembly line. I mean, all kinds of amazing things that have stayed with us. And I have no doubt that the level of innovation coming is going to be extraordinary. That's partly a function of the fact that what COVID has done is digitize the economy really fast. Yuval Harari did an interview a few weeks ago, and he said, my university tried for a decade to put some of the courses online. Now, all of the university is online in a week. And so this extraordinary streamlining and move to a digital space will be highly efficient and produce organizations that are much more effective. And so that's the good news. At the same time, this creates a lot of disruption. And I'm a believer that, and as a maker of drones and autonomous vehicles, robotics myself, that automation and robotics do not cause unemployment. We've had them around since the invention of the weaving loom back in the early 1830s. And if I look around the world, what we've seen until COVID was record level employment everywhere. Not just in spite of automation, but in fact, because of automation. So COVID, in a sense, it just speeds that process. And what it means is a lot of people are going to have to change how they work. It's not that they won't be working ultimately, but they may be unemployed for a period of time, but they will definitely have to change how they work. We all will. So innovation is definitely in play, and that's a good thing. I will also say that I think this is going to mark the end of a period of history, which is a period of deflation. And what we're going to see the reintroduction of is some inflation. And some people think that's a crazy idea. No, it's a highly controversial thing to say. But I think that the provision of free money and record sums and the loss of the global supply chain and technological innovation in the short term all conspire to give us higher prices. And let's face it, inflation is not just about data and data points. It's about your personal views, your personal expectations. And what COVID has done is create the idea that it's worth spending £1 to buy an egg or a £5 note to buy a loaf of bread because there might be shortages. And once that gets into the psyche, I can see that prices could be rising in future as we restore the economy. I will say also the global supply chain. It used to be that the definition of globalization was basically all the jobs and all the production went to China. Now we're going to see the relocalization of production everywhere. In other words, supply chains will be built and deepened in every part of the world. And maybe this is not a bad thing altogether. I mean, why is it we didn't have enough ventilators? I would argue in part it's because no one in the finance world would finance anything other than software for the last 15 years. They wouldn't touch hardware because that all went to China. Now we realize that you have to build hardware as well as software. And I think the other question is, even if you had the ventilators, why don't we have enough healthcare professionals to operate the ventilators? And that is a really good question to be asking. Why is it that we require our medical professionals to go through such very long periods of preparation in order to enter the field? And have we narrowed the incoming pool to such an extent that we have unnecessarily limited who can serve in the medical profession? And I think there's going to be a redefining of what is the requirement and what is the level of experience required, because we just obviously need more healthcare professionals, especially in a world where the whole biotech industry, its whole function is the editing of genes these days. And we cannot be surprised if we see other things like COVID surprise us when we're innovating at the sharp end of genetics. The very last thing I'll say on all this is one way to think about the future economy as well is that it's a trade-off between efficiency and resilience. In Formula One racing, they every single day disassemble those cars and they try to shave a single gram of weight off of the chassis. And I think that we've been shaving that gram off in the interest of efficiency. And that does let you win the race, but at some point, the car will actually break apart. And what COVID has done is to reveal where that 1 gram is. And so going forward, there's going to be much more emphasis on resilience and less emphasis on efficiency. Again, another reason that I see production around the world being relocalized. The hardware will become the new software. And all of this means a very different economy than we've had before, with many good things and some tough things as well that are yet to be addressed. I suspect that once governments put these sorts of policies in place, like free money at 0 interest rates forever, it's very difficult to unwind it. And so these are all kind of existential questions, but fundamentally, I'm optimistic that we're going to have a fine economic future. The question is, how bumpy is it for the near term?
Thank you, Pippa, for your remarks. That's certainly very interesting, talking about the economy in the future. I'd like now to move to our next segment, which is the panel discussion. So going back to Ravi, you mentioned that the Spanish flu really taught a lot of lessons. And what lessons have we learned from the 1918 Spanish flu that have been applied to today?
Well, we've only applied half the lessons. I would say that one of the important things is that a lot of the laboratories, like the Rockefeller Institute and some of the ones in Europe, were all working independently. So one of the lessons that we've learned is actually we should work together. And as Dr. Thompson mentioned, and Pippa mentioned as well, that we now see that there is something to be said for collaboration. So you see the World Health Organization, the CDC, and a number of institutions being set up out of that. We also see that communication is really important, getting the message out there, because during the Spanish flu, the media and the newspapers in particular were in the control of the military. And in the midst of the World War I, they didn't want anything getting through to the Central Powers to notify them that the Allies were in a weakened state. I mean, as the Spanish flu arrived in Western Europe, by the end of that summer, 10% of the entire British force was in hospitals. And there is data and there is evidence to suggest that the Spanish flu, once it hit the German forces, it actually knocked the wind out their sails and ended the war early. So there is information, there is knowledge to be gained in that. If something happened in part A of the world, by and large, it will end up in part B. And therefore, communication between all the different moving parts, as things have globalized, is vital to contain it.
So you mentioned part A affecting part B. What effect has globalization then had on the potency of pandemics? And is it something we can see in the future affecting us greatly?
The globalization, so as Pippa mentioned, we're going to see a kind of going back to things being made locally. Now, in the midst of all this, we've had geopolitics, we've had environmental issues, all these other things are so interconnected because of things like the internet, where people can form their own communities in much larger voices. and in strength in numbers, shall we say, thanks to the internet. So the pressure on governments and the pressure on businesses and the financial institutions to work together to solve problems is going to be even greater, more so than when the Spanish flu happened.
Okay. George, I'd like to ask you a bit more about the response from the government to lockdown. Do you feel that the government has responded appropriately to the current crisis?
Thank you. I think the lockdown was something that was absolutely necessary for the reasons I've outlined in my opening comments. I would probably argue that we could have, certainly in the UK, locked down a bit sooner than we did, and we may have seen less cases of COVID and less deaths at this point as a result. And actually, one of the historical lessons from Spanish flu, if you look back to some data from the United States, there were a couple of cities in the States, one of which, as soon as they realized that Spanish flu had hit them, effectively locked down or at least banned all large public gatherings, whereas the other city allowed a St. Patrick's Day parade to go ahead. And the difference in mortality rate from Spanish flu in those two areas was really quite stark. So the lessons are there. This virus at the moment is, I think, probably more contagious than the Spanish flu was, and was inevitably coming to every country in the world because of globalization and air travel, and probably very quickly, and had probably been present in most countries for longer than the authorities realized. So my view is absolutely lockdown was necessary. I think we're now in a situation where they are not in the UK, certainly is probably now less than one, looking at data that are coming through. And so at some point in the next few weeks, I would imagine we will start to look at some form of reduced lockdown. What that will be is open to speculation, but I've talked a little bit. But I think myself and a lot of colleagues in the UK were really itching to see the government lock us down sooner than they did.
Okay. Pippa, from your perspective, do you think the world, specifically the UK, has responded appropriately and well with a balanced view of this pandemic?
So this is one of those super interesting public policy issues where the immediate need was absolutely clear. Time is the part that you can't account for, really, because we have no sense of how long will the lockdown have to last. But what is clear is the collateral damage to the economy and causes of death other than COVID rising, because people are afraid to go to the hospital, or because we've had all sorts of things, domestic violence taking lives. And so from a policy point of view, what will start to happen is they'll begin to balance COVID as a cause of death versus other things, versus greater costs. And that's why the second wave is going to be so important, because there's the risk that if the government starts to unwind and then we do get a second wave, then they'll have to potentially face the same set of decisions again. And I think it gets harder over time to justify the loss of life from the one cause versus loss of life and livelihood of all the other collateral damage caused by the decision to lock down. I mean, there's a huge amount of goodwill. People want to do this and to get it right. But the question is, how long can they do it without sacrificing every other structure in the economy? And I have a question actually for George on this, which is, what about the parts of the world where there is no lockdown, where there are no controls? And so let's say in the major industrialized countries, we get this right, but we have still international travel going on. And in other words, the application of this policy is obviously not uniform, and in some parts of the world, non-existent. So what does that do in terms of the prospects for the reintroduction? And that's related to another point, which is, how many strains have we got? And if you're immune to one, does that mean you have any immunity to any other? Like, again, I know we have no data, but this is like the question is, can you get it again?
Absolutely.
Gosh, okay.
Tough
That
ones, I know.
was a lot of questions. So I'll take the last one first, if I may. I think the answer is the jury is out. We're not sure whether you can catch it again with other coronaviruses, and there are a lot of coronaviruses, quite a number of which cause kind of the common cold in human beings. But what we think we know about those is that the antibodies don't hang around forever, so you may actually it's possible to be infected again. Whether that applies to SARS-CoV-2, we don't know. It's probably a little bit, I mean, I talked about one study that looks at possibly two variants of this virus. One study in Science doesn't prove anything. So I think we need to understand a lot more about the virology of this agent as we go forwards. And I would probably come back to the comment I made about Iceland. I think we're learning more and more as we go along with this virus. If the data from Iceland and the USS Theodore Roosevelt are correct, then a significant number, probably the majority of people who are infected with this virus, particularly younger people, are asymptomatic. And what we don't know at the moment in countries like the UK is how many of the population might have had it already. I touched on the 82% previous infection and therefore immune to reach herd immunity. That's assuming an R naught of 5.7. If the R naught is less than that, then you can adjust the figure for herd immunity. But what that means inevitably, if let's say 25% of the population have already had this, is that when you reduce lockdown, not everybody is going to be able to get infected, and therefore the R naught presumably is going to be less. And that's really a question for somebody who's an expert in epidemiology. But I think we'll find, I mean, that's why I said, I think with a rigorous test, track, trace process, with society being willing to have limited local lockdowns again, then I think some form of relaxation of lockdown sooner than later will be possible. And that indeed is what we've seen in Southeast Asian countries, some of whom have done this really effectively. And the other point I didn't touch on is the use of face masks. If you look at the growth rate of this infection in those countries, which is mainly Far Eastern countries, where wearing a face mask when you go out in public is the norm anyway, what is shown, and there's a really neat study from the US that shows this, and also talks a lot about the economics as well. In countries that use face masks, the rate of infection is significantly lower than it has been in westernized countries where we don't wear face masks. So I think through a combination of measures, relaxation of lockdown will be possible, and I think probably safe. And it may not be necessary for governments to introduce complete lockdowns again as we go forwards.
Hey, Ravi, going back to you just 1 second. So do you think these pandemics will be more common in the future?
Most definitely. I've seen in doing research for this that there is a general panic in the environmental community that the melting permafrost will unleash a wave of pathogens and microbes that humanity hasn't dealt with for a long time or ever. And I think looking at history, there's a huge argument for a lot of the what we call first world countries investing in what we call third world countries, investing in their infrastructure, investing in their doctors and systems to stop or mitigate a lot of the problems that would happen if a pandemic happened again. And also, I would see it as a business opportunity as well. You know, why can't we export the NHS? Why can't we strike up a deal with some of these countries and say, right, in exchange for a trade deal, we will send over some of our best and brightest to help you get to a standard where you can look after your own people. But as the earlier quote from the book, this was as going back to the third millennium, in the middle and at the outset of the Bronze Age. Yet there are places in the world that don't even have that level of infrastructure. So it's a given of history that pandemics will happen. It's just a matter of when and how bad it will be. One of the key integral parts of the Spanish flu was that there was an overconfidence and over-reliance on their science. And as Dr. Thompson mentioned, out of that came antibiotics. Dr. Avery Oswald laid the foundation stone for DNA. That came out of it. And Dr. Jenner discovered penicillin. And a lot of these things happened afterwards. And I feel, historically looking back, have become overconfident in our science. But knowing, and some of the things that I've read one case where there was a UFC fighter who was traveling in Africa and caught a pathogen or caught a bug of some kind, and they've thrown everything they've had at it and it hasn't had any impact on it. So that these things exist, it's just a matter of when and how prepared we will be.
Okay, so you can talk about being prepared for the future. So is synchronized global lockdown a thing then for the future? Is that something you see happening more regularly, or a potential for it to happen in the future?
The problem is geopolitics, decision making, policy making. When you have a potential adversary, how do you work with that adversary? We've seen reports and news articles of a disinformation campaign from China. We've seen reports and news of this virus being used as a bioweapon. There needs to be a level of trust in order to make that lockdown, global lockdown, workable. So that's the first question. And again, some of the things that I've covered regarding policy making and decision making. So, we've seen that the British government, American governments had plans for pandemics, but the inability to act exacerbated the problem. We've seen that through history, the inability to take it seriously. At the height of the Spanish flu, the president, I think President Harold Wilson, just refused and said, I don't believe this, and exacerbated the problem.
Sure.
So in order to move forward, there needs to be an open dialogue, and there needs to be a consensus that this is going to happen again. Therefore, we need to put some of our animosity aside and work together. And I think one of the ways forward is through business and trade and saying, right, we will help you build up so this doesn't affect you or has a less of an impact on the world. And one of the important things from history is when this pandemics hit, it leaves large swathes of area depopulated, which has a profound effect on supply chain and food supplies. So a lot of the times the pandemic may have killed X million people, but it's the famine that kills tens of millions of people. And again, I've seen reports this week that this could happen to us. So at some stage we have to learn from history, and at some stage we have to get over our geopolitical issues, because the virus will cut through any army. No matter nuclear weapons, no matter missiles, will stop this thing.
Okay. Well, you mentioned supply chain and investment. So Pippa, I'm coming to you now. So global lockdowns in the future, what's the effect on investors or potential investors with regards to this?
So what I find is investors are definitely still looking at deals. They're trying to assess what kind of businesses are COVID proof, what will work in future. The business that I run, making drones and autonomous vehicles, I mean, I give people the ability to pick up a mobile phone and say, I want to see my mining site in Africa right now, or my agribusiness in Brazil, and actually have an autonomous vehicle go give them that view and all the data. Having said that, I think Robbie's point is really crucial. We are seeing an extraordinary hit to global food production because farmers can't go in their fields, migrant workers can't move across borders. I think, one of the reasons they canceled Oktoberfest this year in Germany is because 90% of the hops are in one particular region of Germany, and all of it is harvested by migrant workers. And that isn't happening. So this kind of knock-on effect is very serious. So yes, investors are still active and looking. Now with all the free money that central banks have thrown into the system, there will be money to deploy, but the question is in what? What will actually make the most sense? And this is still an open question. We definitely see, like I said, the digitization of businesses, which renders them massively more efficient. And, you know, new things get created in these environments. You know, parts of the economy that never existed before suddenly come to life. One of them, and it may sound small, it may sound frivolous even, but I've been very interested in this, what they're calling online cloud clubbing, where a Paris DJ had to cancel a gig, and he decided rather than not do it, he would just go online and hold it effectively over Zoom. And this has become huge now. And instead of people listening to radio or trying to find out what's the cool new music, listening to, you know, Spotify, they'll go on these forums. It's a completely new way of delivering entertainment. So I'm not saying that compensates for the loss of everything else in the world economy, but I'm just saying there are lots of new things that are coming to life that we don't even know are there yet. So I'm very optimistic always that innovation persists. And like I said, in a really tough period of history, right after World War I and the Spanish flu, people invented extraordinary things that are still with us today. So I have no doubt we're going to see extraordinary innovation. Nobody knows exactly where as well. And I would say probably more everywhere than before.
Absolutely. George, Pippa mentioned earlier about the constraints of the medical profession and limited number of doctors. Can you expand a little bit more about that for us?
I think the concept of specialization, so I'm a diabetes and endocrine specialist, but I've always done a lot of general medicine, which is really what we're talking about with COVID. But actually, most doctors, most nurses are trained fairly generically until they reach a certain kind of tipping point, at which point they go off into specialty. And actually what we've seen, certainly in the NHS, is a lot of doctors and nurses who perhaps do other things as a day job, going off and starting to look after patients in ICUs, supported by the specialists. So I'm not sure that in my experience, it's necessarily so much a shortage of medical and other clinical staff as possibly a shortage of capacity. Certainly if you look at what happened in northern Italy and also Spain, particularly Madrid, for example, they just didn't have the physical space. And that's why we saw in the UK, the British government very quickly scale up about 10,000 extra beds in the so-called Nightingale hospitals. Now, yeah, sure, it's going to be a little bit difficult to staff those, but you can box and coax by moving staff from other areas. I've kind of realised as you guys were talking that I didn't actually answer one of Pippa's original questions, which is what about those parts of the world where there just isn't the modernised medicine or the ability to actually lock down. But I suppose in many ways we're talking about developing and third world countries. And interestingly there, the conditions that we know that put you significantly more at risk of severe disease and death from COVID-19 are probably less prevalent. So for example, we know that if you've got diabetes, if you've got high blood pressure, if you've got ischemic heart disease, you're significantly more at risk from COVID than if you don't have those. And interestingly, for what we think is a respiratory disease, actually, if you have pre-existing lung disease, your risk is lower of death from COVID than it is if you've got high blood pressure or heart disease. So this is an interesting virus. It's perhaps not a standard respiratory virus. And I think the other point, just picking up a kind of thought that Ravi stimulated, we tend to think of pandemics as infectious diseases. In 2006, I published with the chap that went on to become the lead for the International Diabetes Federation, a paper about what we call pandemic diabetes. And in fact, in 2006, I think diabetes became a cause of more deaths worldwide than HIV/AIDS. And so it's probably wrong to think of pandemics as just communicable or infectious diseases. And in fact, there is a pandemic of non-communicable disease, obesity, diabetes, high blood pressure, heart disease, that is largely a result of all the factors that Pippa touched on. And perhaps one of the things that may change going forwards is that we may see a different emphasis on populations being healthy, which takes me back to my response to developing countries. It may be that the impact of COVID is less there because they perhaps don't have some of the risk factors. It's not to say it won't affect them, but it may not affect them as badly as some Western countries.
Sure. Thank you for that, George. So our first question from the audience today by Sagar: which country's approach to the crisis has stood out for being most fitting? George, I'd like you to expand on that if you don't mind.
I think from a testing point of view, I'm very struck by what South Korea and Iceland have managed to achieve. And so I would probably pick some of the countries in the Far East as having responded particularly well. I think European and Western countries were probably a little bit slow to learn from what they were doing in the Far East, and perhaps locked down a bit later than they could have done. And it's going to be a question for the future when we look back on what happened to see whether or not, with proper modelling techniques, had we locked down sooner, would we have been able to come out of lockdown more quickly than has perhaps been the case.
Sure. Pippa, what do you think, from an economic standpoint of view, which country has done its best to tackle the current crisis?
I have to admit, I've been following the developments in Hong Kong, and it was very interesting that they shut the border with China very, very quickly. And then they didn't implement a lockdown per se, but because that population had been through the avian flu and SARS, there was a kind of knowledge amongst the public already that it's a dangerous situation and one needs to take certain precautions. And so people were already accustomed to wearing face masks, and they were already accustomed to changing their behavior. And I wonder too if that tells us something about the future, is that once the population has experienced this, the next time is not so hard because they already know what needs to happen. And so I don't know how much of that we give credit to the government for the policy, or how much we give credit to the population for having been further advanced on the learning curve.
Do you then think there's going to be an increased investment into public services to tackle social inequalities?
This is a super interesting question. I think there's definitely going to be investment in biomedical, and that will be the hot topic now. And interestingly, Britain is really front and center of that. The development of the Crick Institute and the Biomedical Center in North London and Cambridge and Oxford has created one of the world's leading research centers in the biomedical space. So I think this is going to be a huge area of investment. More broadly, will there be investment in the inequalities? That's a different story. I suspect that with the government having announced that nobody has to pay rent or mortgage or tax for a period of time, it's going to be very difficult to announce the end of that because nobody's got any money in the bank to be able to pay that stuff. And now they won't necessarily have a job. So I wonder if this is the beginning of a creation of a universal basic income approach kind of through the back door. Because either way, these people are going to end up on the government payroll. And it's arguably better if they end up on these kinds of policies rather than straightforward unemployment. Because straightforward unemployment is demoralizing. It creates identity issues. It's hard to get off of. And one of the issues economists are talking about is, are we paying people more to stay home and not work now than to work? And what kind of distortions does that cause in the economy? So I think there's going to be a lot of public policy argument about not how do we unwind the lockdown, how do we unwind the economic policies associated with the lockdown? That may be even a bigger argument.
Absolutely. George, a question for you. This is a question from Saga. What's your view on what Germany is doing correct that UK did not do?
Great question, thank you. One of the things that Germany did correct was that the population that got infected were much younger than some of the other countries where the outbreak has been far worse. Why was that the case? Well, Germany introduced a lot of testing very early on, and I think it was therefore possible to test, track and trace people that were infected. But fundamentally, it does look as if younger people in Germany were perhaps more affected quite early on, and that may in itself have had an influence. The figures from Germany do suggest, if you look at the two different spike protein variants, that it's probably not related to the actual virus itself that was infecting them so much as other factors. And I mean, again, I would turn back to Iceland and say in Iceland, it was possible for them to, I mean, they had a limited lockdown in Iceland. So, I mean, from what I've read, they banned public gatherings of more than 20 people. But compare that to the UK situation where we're not allowed to meet in groups of 2 or more than 2 people. And I think the Icelanders did this well because they were able to test so many people. And yeah, okay, they've got a small population, so perhaps it's easier to do that at scale in their country. But nevertheless, there are, I think, definitely lessons learned there about the importance of testing, tracking and tracing.
Okay. Ravi, I think I'm going to come to you now. So a question from Abhishek. Do you think the wearing of face masks in Eastern countries is a direct result of epidemics of the recent past? And do you think that we may adopt this for a long time to come?
It depends whether we adopt it or not. Depends on the culture entirely. It's something that I've been thinking about recently. Have we seen a regression in our society as a result of our overconfidence in certain things? For example, literacy in science, literacy in medicine through time. So one of the things I did read up on was the origins of these face masks, and one of the hypotheses is that the reason why face masks are prevalent in Far East Asia or other parts of Southeast Asia is because of pandemics and a constant occurrence of these epidemics in these countries. So they've become accustomed to dealing with them. It's something that we haven't had to, in the West, had to deal with for a long time, at least until a number of outbreaks that we've been able to contain because of we've had policy and things in places. One of the things that I'm looking for or looking out for is regression, because that tends to happen on the back of these pandemics, as history shows. So where that regression happens, how it happens, is something that I'm actually mindful for.
George, what do you think about this?
So I think face masks, and I remember going to a conference when the SARS epidemic or outbreak was live, and all the European delegates were kind of looking sideways, if I can put it that way, at the delegates from Hong Kong and China, who were all sitting in the conference centre wearing face masks. But actually, if you then take a more evidence-based approach, Neil Ferguson, who's in the UK, people will know the name because he's one of the government advisors and was behind the modelling study that showed that and led to the immediate lockdown on the 23rd of March in the UK, which is the day that the paper was published. But the modelling that they did showed if you didn't lock down when they did, the curve would be so steep that the NHS would become overwhelmed, just as happened in Italy and Spain. And I mean, it's pretty clear now that these guys were right. But back in, I think, about 2008-9, Neil Ferguson's group ran a study looking at the use of face masks in households where a family member had influenza. And I mean, there were two findings that struck me from that paper. Number one, people tend to forget to wear the face mask quite quickly. But in those households where people did faithfully wear the face mask, the transmission rate of influenza, which we all think of as a fairly contagious virus, the transmission rate was significantly reduced in those households where people wear face masks. So I think although time may tell that I'm wrong with COVID-19 or SARS-CoV-2, I think there is probably reasonable circumstantial evidence from other viral agents that the use of face masks is actually clinically effective if people wear them faithfully.
Okay. Question for you, Martha. You mentioned that there's a need to retrain the workforce in certain industries. Is this a good time to invest into green technologies?
So I think the answer is yes, because now there is a heightened awareness of the systemic consequences of the choices that we make. People, I think, have taken this time to really consider what are knock-on effects. And so, yes, I mean, people were already very focused on climate change, environmentally friendly buying and backing businesses that support that. But I think the answer is even more so now. The question of innovation is, I think, clear. There's going to be enormous innovation in that space, and it will attract money. So yeah, I think that the green part persists. Now, one factor has occurred that is a wrench in that argument, and that is the price of oil has literally gone negative, minus $34 a barrel at its lowest recently. That means they need to pay you to take the oil away, right? This is incredible. We've never seen this in history. And the problem is, if the price of oil is so cheap, then it becomes expensive to invest in other technologies. If you really care about the environment, then you want a high oil price because it finances the investigation into other methods. So I suspect this will slow things down for a while. I think the other thing too, it's not on that point, but to think about is that I talked about the digitization of the economy, and George talked about the track and trace. One of the things that's occurring is the state and large corporations are gathering massively more data and information about individuals. And COVID has been the excuse. For example, Apple and Google sharing location finder data with governments. And I suspect, I tend to agree again with Yuval Harari on this point, that yes, this may be necessary from a healthcare perspective in the immediacy of the moment, but if we are not careful and we leave these things in place, there may be victims of COVID that we haven't considered yet, like we already see the loss potentially of habeas corpus, the protection of personal freedom, that you can't just be arrested for walking down the street on suspicion, but now you can. And so these are issues that I know law enforcement officials around the world are thinking about, struggling with. Even they are not sure that they want to see these traditional democratic protections unwound for the sake of one virus. So I think that's another area to think about.
Absolutely. A question for you, Nicola, once again. So is COVID likely to result in deglobalization? And if so, what's the likely impact? Question from Babak.
So I think the key is the definition of the word globalization. In my view, the old definition was all the jobs and all the production went to China. The new definition of globalization is all the jobs and all the production go everywhere. So you could argue that the new version of globalization is much more global in nature than the old version was. But this all depends on your point of view. Some people think that you'll get a more efficient supply chain by running it all to China. Others are not so sure. In the US, for example, there are many numbers thrown around, but maybe something like more than 80% of all pharmaceutical drugs in the United States come from China. And now the American public is saying, wait, why is this? Why don't we have a more diversified supply chain? Why are we not producing any of these substances in the US? And so this is the relocalization of production is another version of globalization. But some people will say it's the reverse. I would say it's an extension.
Ravi, what's your view on this?
There's a quote that I like to use quite often. It's by Helmut von Moltke, the Elder. He says that no plan survives contact with the enemy. Every major government had a plan to deal with a pandemic. Will we find out how well it worked? Will we find out how well we did? How well the government did? There are so many questions that need to be answered post-pandemic. And I would say that we're in the middle of it still. We've just hit the top and coming slightly down. And historically, if anything, the lesson to take away is decision-making equals lives. Do our leaders have the will to act? Do they have the joined-up thinking with other governments and other intergovernments? Do our curriculums reflect an understanding that we've actually learned something from this? So as Britain enters Brexit, and it will effectively be alone in the world in terms of economics, not attached to their European economic zone, what role will we play as a nation? And what's telling in all of this is who our friends are and who our adversaries. We've seen spats between India and America. We've seen spats between Russia and Europe. All these little spats, are they personal or are they national? And ultimately, the person that will suffer as a result of this decision-making will be the lowest rungs of society. Okay. So there are lessons to be learned from this, and I'm just waiting to see who's learned them the best.
George, a question for you from Rashekar. Are epidemics and pandemics more common originating in the Far East, for example, China?
I don't think there's necessarily any evidence for that. And I mean, I would probably fire the question to Ravi rather than myself, actually, because historically, I think epidemics probably didn't come from the Far East. And again, I would just come back to the comment I made about not just limiting the word pandemic or epidemic to infectious diseases. The pandemic of obesity and diabetes probably started actually in the United States. And I used to have a slide that I used at talks where the CDC actually every year show the US split into states and a color-coded map. And what you saw, if you followed that map for 10 years, was the march of states that start off light blue, which is a fairly low incidence of obesity or diabetes, gradually turning red until practically the whole of the United States turned red. And at that time, I was pointing out that I thought that the United Kingdom, who are usually about 15 years behind the US, were going to head in the same direction. And what you also saw, if you plotted that map of the US for obesity with diabetes, was that diabetes followed suit about 3 to 4 years after the obesity hit them. So I'm not sure that pandemics and epidemics originate from the Far East. This one probably did, but then perhaps, as I think Pippa and Ravi were saying, they were just more aware of previous epidemics because they'd lived through SARS and MERS in the Far East, and therefore were perhaps just more switched on to a new virus and recognised it. I'm not saying it didn't come from a wet market, but I think lessons that will be learned as we look back, one of them will be to try and work out where this came from, and we may never know.
Ravi, I mean, what do you think about this? George mentioned wet markets and history lessons as well. So what is your viewpoint?
No, I don't think there's anything to back it. Well, people can say recent history and, you know, make the argument that way, but over a longer period, no, I don't think, you know, there's anything specific about the Far East. You know, if you look at, I mean, on your Instagram, you shared a photo of all the different viruses and bacteria that have affected, or pandemics rather. The largest one is smallpox. Throughout history, you know, we find Ramses V, the Egyptian mummy, that had smallpox. So if you're going that far back, but if we look at, you know, through the finding of the New World, smallpox went from Europe to the Americas, but syphilis went from the Native Americans to the European theatre or to the European world. So, you know, there are different pathogens in different parts of the world that affect people differently. It's just that some are more lethal than others.
Okay. A question for George by Dr. Nikunj Thapala. The threshold to discharge patients to free of capacity for patients is lower normally at the moment. People are requiring multi-split input into post-hospital stay. How will the NHS cope with this?
So I'm not sure that I would agree that the threshold for discharge has changed. What has happened, and I think Pippa touched on this, is that we are seeing far fewer admissions coming into the hospitals in the UK at the moment. And many of us, myself included, are really worried that we're going to see quite a tidal wave of people who've become very ill through non-COVID related conditions. So perhaps those that stayed at home when they had chest pain and were having a heart attack will now come in with heart failure at some point in the future. So I'm not convinced that the threshold for discharge has necessarily changed. I think community services, however, are busier than perhaps they would have been, because patients, again, as Pippa suggested, are I think frightened of coming to hospitals at the moment, because they know that hospitals are places where there is bound to be quite a lot of COVID, because that's what hospitals do. So I think the reason why community services may be busier is not related to discharge criteria in hospitals at the moment, so much as the fact that the public are actually behaving in a different way. And certainly if you look at the way that the NHS has structured itself over the last couple of months, we very quickly were able to move to what had been a pipe dream just a few years ago, which is patients that don't need to come to hospital being able to be managed in a different way. And picking up one of Pippa's points as well, patients that do need to come to hospital for outpatient appointments are now having their outpatient appointment done using Zoom or Skype or some other digital medium, wherever it is not necessary for the doctor to examine the patient. What does that mean to community services? Well, it means that if a blood test is required for that consultation, that test is done in a community setting. So I think what we will see going forwards is probably a slightly different way of thinking of health services, so that perhaps we do front load healthcare at home and provision of digital services from hospital specialists in a way that has not happened in the past.
Okay, so in your view then, George, finally, can you tell me, what do you think the new normal will look like going ahead?
It depends on what angle you're really asking the question from. I think in many ways the new normal is going to look very much like the old normal, but with the caveats that I think Pippa's absolutely spot on. I think that we will have learned a lot of lessons from this, or I hope we will. It is not necessary for everybody to get in a car and travel to an office to work. They're working very effectively, thank you very much, using technologies like this one. And this is the first time I've used Zoom, but I'm impressed with it. And it means that I don't have to travel halfway around the world in an aeroplane to give a talk. I can give a talk sitting in the comfort of my own study, knowing that there's a glass of wine waiting for me downstairs when I finished.
Absolutely. Pippa, in your point of view, what's the new normal from an economic standpoint?
Oh, I think it may take a while to find out what normal is. If we're gonna get into rolling lockdowns, then it's going to take longer to establish what the new normal is. And I don't think it's right that that everything goes digital. I think we're going to have wonderful results, as George quite rightly says, from, now you can do so much over Zoom and over other platforms, and that's great. But I also think there's some things that do require human interface. I think not everyone can afford spaces to work at home. In that sense, COVID has been very unfair in the lockdown to those who live in limited accommodation with kids and limited space, and to ask them to work effectively from home is really hard. So I don't know, but I think the nature of the workplace is definitely profoundly changed by this. We may find that, restaurants have fewer tables and more space between them. We may find that restaurants start to provide workspaces as well as eating spaces, that temporary smaller work environments may become more attractive. I think there are many things that are going to change. One thing I see is old rules start to be rethought. Like, for example, in this country, planning permission for a building, it's either residential or office space. And one of the things that might have helped in this crisis is if you were to give planning permission for buildings to have office space on some levels, urban farming on some levels. Now you have the ability to feed populations in urban areas when these events happen. In other words, you build in more resilience by addressing the public policy stance. And so anyway, all of that is yet to be negotiated. So I don't think we can see what the new normal is yet, but it'll be different than what we had before.
Okay. I'd like now to invite each of our speakers to give their closing remarks, starting with Ravi.
History tend to be written by the winners. We don't know who the winners is going to be out of this pandemic, but it's important to remember that one, decision-making equals lives. Engineering and healthcare cannot be separated. Again, the consequences, if we go according to history, is disastrous for most populations. And there needs to be a greater level of trust. One of the big things that I've seen from social media is that there's empathy between populations around the world dealing with issues and dealing with challenges. The outpouring of love and support for doctors in Italy and people being affected in Italy from the UK and other places. And I can only hope that the lessons that we have learned from this is that pandemics are with us. We need to reevaluate our relationship with nature and science. And going forwards, we need to build institutions that can handle problems like this. It requires joined up thinking on a global level, not just a political level within our own countries. As I say this, living on an island, no country and no individual is an island, but we are a planet, we are one planet. We only have this planet, we only have this supply chain, we only have what we can see and touch and feel on this planet. And if we are not careful and if we don't learn from history, it will take one thing to wipe it all away. Just as history gives us questions, it also gives us answers. When decisions aren't taken, we were discussing the Spanish flu. Of the 100 million people that died, 25 of those million people were in India alone. That was 6% of its total population at the time. Can we afford to make decisions like that? And I can only implore that people listening, watching, take an active interest in what the next 10 years, 15 years looks like, and look at some decisions that are made and where they can play an active role in shaping it to make the world a better place.
Okay. George?
Okay. So I talked a little bit about the different approaches that different countries have taken. And the kind of scientist in me says that that is probably the largest ever research opportunity that the world has seen, because there are going to be lessons that we can learn, and we can use different approaches that have been adopted around the world effectively as separate experiments. And perhaps in time we will understand what worked best. But it's then really important that, unlike the SARS outbreak, when CDC published some superb guidelines about how to handle outbreaks in the future, that we don't learn and then forget, and that we actually try and learn from what worked best this time round, and adopt a kind of more worldwide approach where the whole world embraces and agrees the best things to do the next time a pandemic happens, because another pandemic is going to happen for sure. We know that from history, and we know that from science and from medicine.
Absolutely. Pippa.
So I would finish by saying that I think the aftermath of this, there will be a lot of focus on pandemics, but I suspect that we would do well to focus on what were the underlying conditions that this pandemic exposed. And I agree with George there that there are all kinds of pandemics already in place. They're just not communicable. And we need to assess, why is it that we keep producing a society that's so unwell? And why do we keep having an economy that's so unwell, that's so burdened by record debt, by lack of cash flow? Why is it that, you know, in the US and Britain, something like 60% of the population depend on a monthly paycheck, and half of them depend on a weekly paycheck, and don't have even 400 or 500 pounds in savings for an emergency? These are very serious underlying conditions. And I think we would do well to focus on those, and not only the preparations for the next pandemic.
Absolutely. Thank you all for a fantastic discussion. As always, we've had a huge variety of different viewpoints on pandemics, and a lot of questions to answer and go through as well. I would like to extend my thanks to all the panelists for taking the time out today to come and talk about this personal topic of pandemics, past, present, and future. As well, I'd like to also thank the audience as well for all their questions. They've been fantastic and engaging today. And we will join you on our next Vichar Manthan on the 14th of May on the topic, Is Britain Equal? Exploring affluence and equality within Britain. For those of you who are eager to get your hand on some more Vichar Manthan or VM, I invite you to take part in our weekly book club events. Information can be available on our website, vicharmanthan.org, which are spelled with 2 A's.